this computer. Okay, so our topic tonight is Rosh Hashana, a few things that maybe you didn't hear about Rosh Hashana. Now, it has been my experience that even though all the sources, Jewish sources, are right in front of us, sometimes we don't read them. Somebody once said that the best place to conceal something is to put it in the most obvious place in perfect view of everybody, that nobody looks at it. You know, one time at the entrance to Jerusalem, somebody wanted to grow illegal marijuana, so he grew it on the middle of the entrance road to Jerusalem, right in the middle of the highway. Because who's going to think that in the middle of the highway, okay, then the police came and after it started growing, realized what it was and took it away. But this is a very famous thing that you put things in full view and nobody will see it. So it's sometimes, unfortunately, the same when it comes to our sources, that we have sources and everybody thinks that they know the sources and they read them without actually looking to see what it says. So first I want to talk about the obvious. There are two aspects to Rosh Hashana. The first aspect, or actually I would have to say there are three aspects to Rosh Hashana. Aspect number one, it's the beginning of the days of awe. In Hebrew, Aseret Yemei Tshuva, the 10 days of penitence. In other words, we understand Rosh Hashana as the beginning of this time of the year where we are being judged. In fact, not just us, as it says in Tanakot Tokef, the whole world is being judged. Now, the whole world doesn't know it, but we do. So that's a big responsibility. When you know something that the whole world doesn't know, that's a big responsibility. We can tell the world, they might not believe us, but it is a big response. So when we pray on Rosh Hashanah, we're praying for the whole world. All of the creatures of the world are coming before you like sheep. And each one you count. Moneh v'sofer. Sofer u'moneh. So basically all of God's creatures. And in that sense, we don't disassociate ourselves from the rest of the world. So where do we have that in our mikorot, in our scriptures? So the first one I want to bring to you, I'll try to bring it up in the English so you can see it. It's taken from Rosh Hashana. This one will be in English. Rosh Hashana. I have this stuff in Hebrew, but I want to make sure you get English. Rosh Hashana 15b. See if I can put it on. Rosh Hashana 15b. See if I can find it quickly. On Rosh Hashana 15b, the Talmud says that 3 books are open on Rosh Hashana. 4 times a year, the world is judged. On Passover, judgment is passed concerning the grain, because it's the beginning of the harvest. On Shavuot, it's the beginning of the planting season. On Shavuot, concerning the fruits that grow on the trees. On Rosh Hashanah, all creatures pass before him like sheep. As it says, he who fashions their hearts alike, who considers all their deeds. So the Mishnah says specifically that Rosh Hashanah is the day of judgment. Now the Torah calls Rosh Hashanah Yom Teruah, the day of the blasting of the shofar. But it doesn't actually say what is on that day. It just calls it a holiday, and it's part of the 7 official holidays of the year. When I say 7, I mean 7 days which are Yom Tov, which you don't actually work. But out of the holidays, you might say there are 5 official holidays, which are the 3 pilgrim festivals, Shalosh Regalim, Pesach, Shavuot, and Sukkot. We always start with Pesach because the months start in Nisan. And then, of course, Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur. You can also add to that the Shmini Atzeret, which is considered a holiday by itself, even though it falls out right after Sukkot. So these are the biblical holidays. And the biblical holidays, of course, follow the agricultural year. Now, when you're following the agricultural year, it makes actually sense to start from Nisan. Because in Nisan, you plant, the winter is over, and in an agricultural society, when the winter is over, that's when you plant. Now, it's true, if you grew up in Montreal, there is snow until that time, so you're definitely not going to plant in the snow. And in the spring, there is the possibility to replant. In Israel, we get water in the winter. We don't have snow, but this water is needed so the ground and whatever gets enough. And then we plant Pesach time in Nisan, and we harvest the time of Shavuot. That's why it's called also the festival of the harvest. And Pesach is called the festival of the spring, Chag Aviv. And then Tishrei is when we bring what we harvested during the summer into the granary and into the house, and the grain which was dried out, and everything else is collected before the winter. So that's why judgment is on Passover, because that's when the beginning of the year, the agricultural year. And on Shavuot, because that's when you harvest. But Rosh Hashana is the judgment of the people, not the agriculture, if you notice. Right? So Passover is the agriculture. Shavuot, there's judgment on agriculture. Rosh Hashanah on the people. So this is one of the places I mentioned. The Rosh Hashanah is a day of judgment, one of the first days of the 10 days of penitence. Another place is the Gemara right here somewhere, if I could find it, where it says that 3 books are opened on Rosh Hashanah. I'll try again to see if I can see it quickly, but I'm not sure where it went. Let's just look for a second. It says 3 books are open on Rosh Hashanah. And the 3 books, interestingly enough, are not 3 types of people, are not 3 types of retribution, but 3 types of people. It says there's the book for the righteous, and the righteous are right away inscribed for life. There's the book for the wicked, and the wicked right away in Rosh Hashanah are inscribed for death. And then there's the book for the Beinoni, for the people in the middle, which is probably 99% of the population. And the Talmud says those people in the middle, they get a second chance. Assuming they're not that righteous that Rosh Hashanah, it can be decided to inscribe them for life, they get extra days until Yom Kippur to prove the fact that they are worthy of life in that year. So those are also the beginning of the days, what's called the 10 days of penitence. And I can't see the Makor here, but it's somewhere around these pages. So, so you have 3 books representing 3 types of people. That means that Rosh Hashanah is the day of judgment for 2 out of the 3. Totally righteous and totally wicked. But the rest of us, the 99% of the population, we wait for Yom Kippur. That's our day of judgment. Because of that, Rosh Hashanah is not an official, it's a day of judgment, but it's not a day of asking for forgiveness, which is interesting. You know, Yom Kippur, one of the things that I would say dominate the prayer service of Yom Kippur is al chet. We beat our breasts and we say we did this thing wrong and that thing wrong, and we have the penitential prayer called Hashamnu Bagadnu, where according to the Aleph Beit, right, according to all the letters of the alphabet, we say that we did things wrong, and the al chet, we have the whole alphabet twice, where we mention things. You know, I've always found it interesting. Very righteous people who I know, when they go through the al chets, they say, you know what? I can't believe I did all those things. And people who are not so righteous, they always say to me, there's no way I did all those things. Why am I wasting my time? So this has been my experience, that people who are not that saintly, they always say, I didn't do any of this stuff. And the ones who are very saintly, they say, wow, I can't believe I did all those things. So it's just self-perspective and how you understand yourself. But the Yom Kippur service has a lot of the penitential prayers, really in all the services, in all the 5 services of Yom Kippur. And Rosh Hashanah, it doesn't exist. Aside from Avinu Malkeinu, which is just general petitioning, there's no penitential prayer. There is no asking for pardon and penitence for sin, nothing like that. So how is it a day of judgment, but we don't even ask for pardon? The answer is, it's a day of judgment for the righteous. They didn't wait for Rosh Hashanah to ask for pardon. They do penitential prayers all the time. They don't need a Rosh Hashanah for that. And the other people being judged are the wicked. It's a waste of time on them. So therefore, in Rosh Hashanah, there's no penitential prayer. It's not even allowed. But on Yom Kippur, it is. It's for everybody else. Now, another thing then, so you have these days, and these days, now the Torah actually implies that Yom Kippur is a day of judgment. Because the Torah says about Yom Kippur, V'initem et nafshotechem, you shall afflict your souls on this day, which is understood as your body. That's a discussion by itself. And in the Bible, by the way, the term nefesh does not mean an abstract concept of a soul. It actually means the living life within your body. It is the vitality within your body. That is the nefesh. So when it says you shall afflict your nefesh, it really refers to your body, meaning the living body. So also the Torah says about Yom Kippur, Ki bayom hazeh yechaper lechem. On this day, I shall atone you. Mikol avonotechem, from all your sins. Before God, you shall be purified. So the Torah itself implies that Yom Kippur is a day of penitence and therefore a day of judgment. The Torah does not imply such about Yom Kippur, about Rosh Hashanah, but the rabbis introduced us to this concept that Rosh Hashanah is the secret day of judgment. It's the day of judgment for the righteous and the wicked, and the rest of us are waiting, but it's also the day of judgment when the decrees are being made out to the world. Another thing about this day, if you notice on Rosh Hashanah, we say, may you be written in the book of life, the Shana Tova Tikatevu, right? May you be written. On Yom Kippur, we say, may you be inscribed in the book of life, meaning be sealed. Chatima, Chatima Tova, Gemar Chatima Tova. So Rosh Hashanah we call the writing in the book of life, and Yom Kippur we call the sealing in the book of life. S-E-A, to seal somebody in the, put down the stamp, which means it's considered a period which is drawn out. On Rosh Hashanah, it's decided, okay, this guy maybe could be in the book of life. By Yom Kippur, it's decided fully, and you have the seal. And so it becomes a 10-day time. So therefore, we see this time as a time of possibilities, for the possibility of change. Now, change is a very hard thing for human beings. In fact, it's almost impossible, but it is possible. Almost impossible. Let's say, I'll say it differently. It's improbable, but it's not impossible. So that's something that has to be said. It is hard to change. So, you know, they say, how many psychologists does it take to change a light bulb? Never, you know, the light bulb jokes, you don't know the light bulb jokes, right? How many psychologists does it take to change a light bulb? Well, the answer is the light bulb has to want to change. Yeah. So, yeah, they have a lot of those. So you have like, you don't know, how many Zen Buddhists does it take to change a light bulb? It takes two, one to change it, one not to change it. Okay, whatever. How many Jewish mothers does it take to change a light bulb? The answer is, it's okay, it's broken, we'll sit in the dark. But then they have another one. How many ultra-Orthodox rabbis does it take to change a light bulb? The answer is change. Okay. So let's get back to this. So so Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur, as I said, is a time when we try to work on ourselves. And everything we do is for this. Now, some people say to me, okay, so what's the point? For 10 days, you'll be a nice boy, a nice girl. Okay, you'll try to do everything right. You come to the davening, study Torah, give a little charity, act nicely, ask for forgiveness. That's not serious, because the year has 365 days. So what's 10 days? My answer is, if you can change yourself for 10 days, you can change yourself for the whole year. 10 days is a very long time when you're talking about changing ingrained habits. Very, very long time. Try it. Okay. You know, it's like the old saying, somebody said, quitting smoking, it's a piece of cake. I've done it 1,000 times. If you get the point. Okay. Point is, changing habits is very, very difficult. And if you can do it for 10 days, you can probably do it for the rest of your life. Usually we don't make it to the 10th day. we fumble in the middle and then we try again, and because you have to work on yourself. It doesn't come naturally to us. We like habits. And somebody once said that the hardest part of quitting smoking are the habits that are connected to the smoking. The coffee with the cigarette, the beer with the cigarette, the end of the meal with the cigarette. It's actually not the cigarette. It's the habits that have joined the cigarette that have ingrained it. It's the same thing. Some of the things that we do which are not right are ingrained with other habits and we can't get out of it. So you have to work on yourself. But in Jewish point of view, change is possible. And therefore we pray to God to pardon us. We pray to God because people never pardon. So, if you actually change your way and you're a good person, God will forgive you. People will never. So, unfortunately, that's just life. They once asked, so Voltaire was once asked if, he was considered a heretic by the church because in Candide, he makes fun of some of church doctrines, the idea of the perfect world, whatever. So they once said to him, Professor Voltaire, do you think God will ever forgive you for the things that you write? Voltaire said, mais bien sûr, c'est son métier. Obviously, God is going to forgive me. That's his job, right? So, but that's a little bit more like a Christian point than the Jewish point, because we don't believe in automatic forgiveness. Definitely not in things between man and man. That Yom Kippur is considered a day where God pardons. Ki bayom hazeh yechaper alechem. On this day, I shall atone you. But only things between man and God, because God knows if you had to change your heart or not. And he can also see what's going to happen in the future. So that's easy. If I could see what was going to happen in the future, life would be much easier. So God can always pardon. But human beings, if you did something wrong, you have to ask for forgiveness. God can't pardon you for what you did to somebody. If you gossiped about somebody, if you insulted them, if you stole from them, it doesn't help to go to the synagogue and say, God, forgive me. God will say, okay, you talk to them, and then you come back, and then we'll talk about forgiveness. That's what it says in the Rambam writes in his Laws of Tshuva, and the Mishnah itself actually says this, that Yom Kippur is only for sins between man and God. The sins between man and man, first you ask for forgiveness from that person, and then you ask God. Yes, Sarah?
Sorry, but is it not that before Rosh Hashana, we also go to people and apologize and ask for forgiveness?
Yes, and specifically and in anticipation of Yom Kippur.
But if it's true, because you said people don't usually forgive you, that if you ask the person 3 years for forgiveness,
three times the Mishnah says, if that person fails to forgive you by the third time, but you have to do it sincerely. Like you don't go over to your worst enemy and say, forgive me, forgive me, forgive me. It's like, it's not a ceremony. It's about reality.
The same like today, people posted on social media, they say, if I hurt your feelings this year, I'm really sorry. This is a bit like not as deep, I guess, as it's
That's right. Or I saw somebody once on social media, right? If I hurt you this year, get over it. You're oversensitive. People like, and I think a lot of people think that way. Unfortunately, that's one time my sister I just visited in New York. And I hadn't seen my two sisters for a year and a half, so I figured this was the time. So she was working one time for a company in New York called KPMG. It's an accounting firm, and a large accounting firm. So she had a lot of associates there. She's also a social person. So this woman calls her up before Yom Kippur. I can't remember her name. Let's say Susan, just for argument's sake. Says, "Hi, Susan, how you doing?" Susan says, "Bryna, Bryna is my sister's name. It's a Yiddish name." Says, "Bryna, can you forgive me?" She says, "Why? Did I do something wrong?" She says, "No. It's, well, who knows? But Yom Kippur is coming, so, I want to know if you'll forgive me." So my sister says, "But Susan, you're not Jewish." She says, "What does that matter? This is such a great idea." So some people like that, it's like, but the idea of asking forgiveness, but it's not, you have these people who think it's so cool to ask for forgiveness, But it's really easy to ask for forgiveness from friends. How do you ask for forgiveness from the person you really hurt?
Yes, that's so true.
That's the hard part.
Ravi?
So we like showing how righteous we are by going around to all our friends, forgive me, forgive me. But when you think about that one person who, okay, you slipped, it wasn't on purpose, it was in the heat of an argument, but you're embarrassed to go back to them.
Yeah.
And you figure, oh, so many years they forgot about it. But you know what? They didn't. And that's why they're not talking to you. So those are the hard ones. Those are the hard ones. And mending ways with people is not an easy thing. You don't have to bow down to them or make yourself into a carpet to be walked on, but you do have to act like a man or woman and call them up and say, you don't even have to say sorry. You just say, I want you to know that I'm thinking about you this Rosh Hashanah.
Yeah.
When I say to forgive somebody, I mean somebody that we hurt. But sometimes there are people who hurt us. And sometimes we become even the victim of somebody else. Those people we don't necessarily have to ask forgiveness from. We had a case here in Tel Aviv, I'm now speaking in Jerusalem, of a fellow who went through our class. I don't want to mention names. It was about a year, maybe 2 years ago already. And he wasn't able to finish because he had a lot of things that were difficult for him, but he had very good intent. It turns out that he was the victim of child abuse from his father as a young boy and was never able to get over it. And this was like a phantom that followed him through life. And he said to me one time, when it comes to Yom Kippur, the hardest thing for me is to forgive. He says, I don't think I can forgive my father. I said to him, look, you are his victim. The victim doesn't have to forgive the one who victimized them. If the one who victimized them says, I'm sorry, can you find in your heart to forgive me? That's something else. But you don't have to forgive blindly when you were the victim. So, things are complicated. Sometimes there are people who will say sometimes, you know what? The only way to move on in life is to forgive in your own heart without telling them to move yourself on. That I call something else. That's sort of like freeing yourself from the psychological burden. I agree with that. But I'm just saying, so I don't know if you're referring to any of that, Mariana, but I mean, there are things like that. There were people, sometimes the closest people to us, brothers, sisters, parents, these are the ones that we have to trust. And when they breach that trust, it hurts the most. As it says in Mishlei, that Ne'emanim pitzei ohev, that when a lover hurts you, that's the hurt that hurts the most. So, the ones who are close to us, those are the ones that can hurt us the most. And, that's something more we have to talk to and deal with. But if they're just negative and they never change, you just keep away from them. So, life is complicated. Not everything is black and white. Not everything is black and white. So getting back to this. So these days are called Aseret Yemei Tshuva, the 10 days of penitence, which actually are the days, including Rosh Hashana Yom Kippur, if you're calling them 10, because there's 7 in the middle. We also call it Bein Keseh le'Asor. Asor from the word 10, because Yom Kippur is called Asor, the 10th day. And Keseh, with a hey, refers to Rosh Hashana, because Rosh Hashana is called Ba'Keseh L'Yom Chagenu, the holiday when the moon is covered. Why is the moon covered? Because it falls out on the first of the month when there's no moon. Right? There's a full moon always on the 15th of the month. When you have a new month, the old moon disappeared. The new moon will only appear on the 3rd day of Tishrei. So Rosh Hashanah is on the 1st and the 2nd. There's no moon. So it's called B'Keseh L'Yom Chagenu, the day of concealment. What is concealed? The moon. So that's a verse in the Psalms. So that became the nickname for Rosh Hashanah. That's why we call this time also Ben Keseh La'Asor, between Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, or the 10 days of penitence, Aseret Yemei Teshuvah. Now, I want to show you another interesting source about Rosh Hashanah. And so the first thing, as I said, that Rosh Hashanah then is Rosh Hashanah then begins these 10 days of Yemei Din, of judgment. Not only that, but the Talmud says on the verse in Isaiah, Dirshu et Hashem bihi matza'o, seek God when he can be found. So Talmud says, what does that mean, seek God when he can be found? God is always found. What does it mean when he's found? So it means that during the 10 days of penitence, it's just easier to find God because he's more forgiving. Those are more philosophical, like interpreting, that's the day that you can be found. So that's why it's easier for God and you to get along. But the meaning is, when he can be found, it's easier because God is more interested in helping you during these 10 days, because these are called the 10 days of judgment. And God's judgment is a judgment of mercy. So therefore, these 10 days, it's as if the doors are open and they close. That's why the last prayer of Yom Kippur is called Mi'ilah, the locking of the gate. The locking of the gate represented the locking of the gates of the temple when Yom Kippur was over. But metaphysically, it's also like locking this gate in heaven, which was open, waiting for those 10 days to basically to pardon us. It's like the defending angels are waiting for every opportunity for us to give them ammunition. I'll tell you a story. This story is by Yud Lamed Peretz. Yud Lamed Peretz was, Yitzchak Leib Peretz was a Yiddish writer. I think he lived in Odessa in the beginning of the first half of the 19th century, maybe a little bit later than that. I would say from the middle of the 19th century. You can check with Professor Google. Yitzchak Leib Peretz. A lot of his stuff was also translated into Hebrew, and he also wrote a book in Hebrew on Chassidut. He was from a traditional family, like most Jews of Eastern Europe at the time. A little bit more, let's say, worldly, slightly secularized, and he's considered one of the early Yiddish and Hebrew writers of the 19th century. So he has a story, and the story goes about this fellow. Okay, so this one, again, the imagery of the story is the imagery of the divine judgment, like Rosh Hashana Yom Kippur. So the story is, this man goes up to heaven after 120, which means after death in Hebrew, because in Genesis it says the average person will live 120 years, excuse me. So he goes up to heaven after 120, and he's met in a tribunal with all these angels, and they say, okay, we have to take the statistics. He says, what do you mean? You'll see. So this big scale comes out, and these white angels keep putting his mitzvot, his good deeds, on one side, and these black angels are putting all his bad deeds on the other side. And the scale is tipping this way and tipping that way. And he starts realizing what's going on. He's getting very nervous. Sometimes the black scale is going down, sometimes the white scale is going down. So finally, each side is adding more and more. And then the head angel says, you guys finished? Says, yeah. The scales come out exactly even. So they start inspecting. Maybe there's one which is a little bit low and not exactly even. They can't find any difference. So they look at him and said, okay, well, you don't have enough to get into heaven. So what's supposed to happen? So they're looking. In the meantime, this righteous guy from heaven, because the righteous, they want to help everybody. He says, come over here. The man comes over and he says, you have to understand, the righteous in heaven, they like presents. You have to bring them 3 presents, and then, they might help you get in. By the way, this is a very Eastern European story, but if you live in Israel, it makes a lot of sense too. It's called protektia. Yitzchak Leib's stories very often are mixed together with a lot of the social things from his society at the same time. The idea of the presents, by the way, to the righteous, he's talking about the Hasidic leaders who always get a present before Rosh Hashana, which was usually a honey cake. So anyhow, so he says, how do I do the 3 presents? Man says, you'll go down, you find something unusual that will, every time it's significant, the present will be accepted. All you need is 3. He says, come back, it'll tip the scale. He says, and then the guy disappears. So the soul says, okay, if that's what I got to do, that's what I'll do. So the soul descends back to this world. And the soul is looking for something unusual. But human beings are pretty boring. And their lives are like very uninteresting. That's why we watch television instead of watching our own lives. So I'm just adding that, it's not in the story. So he's looking for something interesting and he can't find it. But then all of a sudden, he sees this man, an old Jew, who was blamed for something he didn't do somewhere in Eastern Europe. And so the soldiers come to him and says, your punishment was rendered, and what you have to do is you have to go through this line of 20 soldiers on each side. They will hit you with their bayonets, and if you make it alive to the other side, we'll let you go. Didn't have a choice. He says, okay, I have no choice, right? He says, that's correct. So he starts walking through, and they hit him in the back, one after another, with their rifles. Back of the rifles, the guy's getting on this side, that side. When he gets after the fifth soldier, his kippah flies off and blows on the wind to the beginning. He puts up at his hand, he says, wait. He goes back to the beginning, puts on his kippah, and starts all over again, gets hit with the backs of the rifles until he goes to the end and passes out. The soul sees that. It takes a little piece of the kippah from this fellow and goes up to the heavens, and then a hand comes out and grabs the thread of the kippah, brings it in, and that was a successful first present. And then the soul descends again into this world. And again, it's looking for something interesting, but human beings are so boring and everything is routine and human life seems so empty. How could there be any possibility of something interesting? And weeks go by and months go by and it looks like years go by. And then he comes across this house and these robbers come into a house, a very rich man. Of course, all his stories are about Jews. So it's like Blade Parrots, because that's the world he lives in. So, and he sees this rich man and the robbers have him, and one of the robbers has a knife to his throat, and they say, don't you dare move or we'll kill you. And they start going through his house and taking gold and silver and whatever they can take from the cutlery and from the candlesticks, and they're putting it into bags. And the rich man is looking and said, well, God gives and God takes, just take, what can I tell you? And then finally, as they're going, they took almost everything in the house. They start going through the drawers, and the bottom drawer they see has another part to it. And the man says, please, anything but that. And they start opening the bottom of the drawer, and the rich man starts to move to try to stop them, and they slit his throat with the knife. And then the burglars looked to see what was in the bottom of that drawer, and it was sand from the land of Israel that was for the burial of this fellow. That's what he was nervous about their taking. And so the soul sees this happening, and he takes one of the grains of sand and starts flying up to the heavens, and a big hand comes out, grabs the grain of sand, and that is the second present. Needs a third. So he goes back into the world and starts looking around. Is there something interesting? Human beings are so boring and their lives are so regular. He says, well, and then all of a sudden, he comes across a young woman who had left the ghetto and was not back on time. And so she's taken by the authorities. How dare you do this? You're not in the ghetto and you're not allowed to, and you broke the rules. But we'll spare your life if you could live through what we're going to do. Says, what is it? Says, we're going to tie you up to a horse and drag you for approximately 10 kilometers. And if you can still live after that, we'll let you back into the ghetto. So she says, I'm willing to do it, but I have one request. I said, what's the request? She says, I need 12 pins. So they bring her 12 pins, and she takes the pins because she doesn't want her dress to fly up while they're dragging her through the streets. So she takes the pins and pins her dress into her flesh of her legs so that the dress will stay down so that she can remain modest. And so they drag her through. And as this is happening, the soul sees that, grabs one of the pins when it's over, starts ascending to the heaven, and a hand comes out and takes the pin and the soul. That's the end of the story. Because we don't have the other places for it. It's a famous story. It's called The Three Gifts. By the way, there's a book translated into English of stories from parrots, and this is also one of them. But again, this idea of the tribunal, of the scales, all these are things that are tied into the way our liturgy sees Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. So this is the first part of Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur, days of judgment, and this ties in very well to the biblical scenario. The second one I already pointed out, and I will point it out again. And this one will be from the Rosh Hashana, from the Talmud in Rosh Hashana, right at the beginning, which is page 2. The Mishnah says, there are 4 days in the year that is the new year. We call Rosh Hashanah, by the way, the new year, which is a different aspect, because the Torah doesn't call Rosh Hashanah the new year. If anything, the Torah says that Nisan is the beginning of the months. It doesn't refer anywhere in the Torah to Rosh Hashanah as being the beginning of the year. So the Mishnah says, there are 4 days in the year that serve as a new year, each one for a different purpose. That's an interpretation. The first day of Nisan is the new year for kings, which means if you have a king, and remember in antiquity, you enumerated the years according to the reign of that king. So the reign of the king is from Nisan. Even if, let's say, he was inaugurated in king in Kislev, you start counting the years from Nisan. And for the festivals, it's also because Pesach is considered the first festival. The first of Elul is considered the new year for animal tithes, which means 1 out of 10 animals were supposed to be given to the temple. Today we don't do that, we redeem them. Rabbi Eliezer, Rabbi Shimon say the first of Tishrei was also the time for the animals in the temple. But the accepted opinion is the first of Elul. The first day of Tishrei is the new year for counting years. When you calculate the sabbatical years and the Jubilee, you start counting from Tishrei. But interestingly enough, it doesn't say that the world was created on this time. It just says that's when you count for the Jubilee and the sabbatical. And for planting. And the first day of Shvat is the new year for trees. And Beit Hillel says the 15th of Shvat, Tu B'Shvat, that's the new year for trees. Okay, so the Talmud says there are 4 New Years. And what are the 4? Okay, the first of Tishrei, that's when we count the years. And this first sabbatical, for the Jubilee, for planting trees, meaning for the Levat. Then you have the first of Elul, for when you're supposed to bring the animal during temple times as a tithe to the temple. The first of Nisan, the beginning of the years for the kings. And Tu B'Shvat, or the first of Shvat, according to Beit Shammai, when things that have to do with trees. But what about the beginning of the universe? Where does that come from? Where is the source that says that there's some connection in the beginning of the universe? So I'm going to read to you a source, just because it's a little bit difficult for me to find everything. My source is here in Ivrit, and that's why I didn't bring this one to you, but I have another one, which is in Ivrit. This is taken from the Midrash. The best one was the Psikta, if I can find it. That was really the best one. It says the name of Rabbi Eliezer. The world was created on the 25th day of Elul. Where does that come from? The world was created. This is called Ba'ikar Rabbah. This is the Midrash on the book of Leviticus. Okay. Rabbi Eliezer says, on the 25th day of Elul, the world was created. Can anybody figure out why he would say the 25th day of Elul? What does that mean about the first day of Tishrei? What happened on the first day of Tishrei if the world was created on the 25th day of Elul? 5 days later.
That's when Adam Arishon was made?
Excellent. According to the sources that we have, all the rabbinic sources claim the first of Tishrei is when Adam and Eve were created, which is on the 6th day of creation. That's why Rosh Hashana, and this now makes sense. If Adam and Eve were created on the 1st of Tishrei, it makes a lot of sense that the day of judgment is when Adam and Eve were created, because judgment is for humans, because we're the only ones who have free will. So what's the 25th of Elul? Assuming 6 days were 6 days times 24 hours, so that means that the universe was created 5 days before, and therefore it's the 25th of Elul. You understand the logic? But we still call Tishrei the beginning, because for us as humans, Tishrei was the beginning of our universe. What happened before they're human beings is really not relevant, because none of us were around anyhow, not even our ancestors' ancestors. So in that sense, it's not relevant to us. So I'm continuing. Rabbi Lezer says on the 25th day of Elul, the world was created, meaning 5 days before Adam and Eve, which was on the 1st of Tishrei. Says this fits with the idea of Rav, who said, this is the day, we say in the prayers, the beginning of your works, which remind us of the first day, meaning the beginning of your works, Adam and Eve, which remind us of the first day, which was 5 days before, etc., etc. So now let me show you a mind-boggling source. Okay, here it is. I gotta get this to the side because okay. It is taught in a Baraita. Can you see that? You see where it says it's taught in a Baraita? The Tanaim disagreed about a certain point. By the way, this version, what they do, the bold print, that's the Talmud. What's not in bold is their explanation. Rabbi Lezer says, by the way, that's the same Rabbi Lezer we just saw from the Midrash on Vayikra. Rabbi Lezer says, in Tishrei, the world was created, but he actually means the 25th day of Elul. We just saw that before. In Tishrei, the patriarchs were born. In Tishrei, the patriarchs died. On Pesach, Isaac was born. On Rosh Hashana, Sarah, Rachel, and Chana were remembered by God to conceive. And on Rosh Hashana, Joseph came out of prison. That's the opinion of Rabbi Lezer. And on Rosh Hashana, our forefathers' slavery in Egypt ceased. And in Nisan, the Jewish people were redeemed from Egypt. And in Tishrei, the future redemption will happen. That is the opinion of Rabbi Eliezer from the 2nd century. Rabbi Joshua disagrees. And he says, in Nisan, the world was created, not in Tishrei. In Nisan, the patriarchs were born. In Nisan, the patriarchs died. On Passover, Isaac was born. On Rosh Hashana, Sarah, Rachel, and Chana were remembered, that for a child, that he agrees. On Rosh Hashana, Joseph came out of the prison, that he agrees. On Rosh Hashana, our forefathers' slavery in Egypt ceased, that he agrees. But in Nisan, the people were redeemed from Egypt, and therefore in Nisan, in the future, they will be redeemed again. So, it says on a Braita, Rabbi Lezer said, how do I know that the world was created in Tishrei? Because it says on the third day, God said, let the earth bring forth grass and yield its fruit. What is the month in which the earth brings forth grass? That would be in the month of Tishrei. But then Rabbi Joshua says, no, I'll prove to you it was created in Nisan, because it says, and the earth shall bring forth grass, which is the month where the earth is full of grass. That's in the month of Nisan. Okay. Anyhow, so they argue the point. But the point is, there is actually an argument in the Talmud whether the world was created in Tishrei or Nisan. Now, to make this more interesting, I'll bring to you another source, if I can find it quickly. I think I saw it here. It was taken from the, I don't see it here. There's a Tosfot. I thought I saw it from this guy's sources, but for some reason it didn't come out here. The Tosfot actually says that the halacha follows Rabbi Joshua that the world was created in Nisan. Okay, and he says, but how do we put these together? God thought about creating the universe in Tishrei, but he actually did it in Nisan. Wait a second. But the whole time we were taught that God created the universe in Tishrei. So what's going on? It's nice that these guys are having an argument, but how come nobody seems to know about it? So I will tell you what I think. Rosh Hashana, according to all opinions, is the day that Adam and Eve were created. Everybody agrees on that. as far as we, as human beings, this is the beginning of the universe. Right? We have an enumeration, by the way, where we enumerate this coming year 5,782 years since anybody know what is since? It's true, we normally say Libriat Olam, but the actuality is it's since the creation of Adam and Eve. Because that is from the first Tishrei. By the way, how do they figure this out? It's very interesting. There was a fellow by the name of, who was a Tana, a Mishnaic scholar, by the name of Yossi, I think just Rabbi Yossi, was a Yossi ben Chalafta, I think it was Yossi ben Chalafta. And he wrote a book called Seder Olam. And he wrote this book in the 2nd century. The book basically is an attempt to enumerate all the years based on the biblical story. We take the biblical story and start from day one being the first of Tishrei, and then count the years, the way they're told chronologically in the Bible. Rashi tries to do this also, by the way. So this Yossi ben Chalafta adds to those years until his time, which was after the second temple destruction. And he wrote a book called Seder Olam, all the events that happened from the beginning till now. And he's the one that we base our tradition on of the 5,782. This is continued after him by another book called Seder Hadorot. Marta, you wanted to say something?
Yes, I didn't want to interrupt you, though.
Okay.
Okay,
I
so-
interrupted me, so now you can say something.
No, I was just curious to know how Judaism responds to when scientists find human fossils that are older than that they claim, I don't know, that are older than 5,000 years. Like, how does Judaism respond?
I will mention this briefly. I actually wrote a few articles about this topic, which I can, one of them, the one I have in English, if you want to look it up, you can look it up online. It's called Rabbinic Attitudes to Scientific Cosmogony. Cosmogony is creation of the universe. In the 19th and early 20th century. There you'll find answers to that question. You can look either on my website. I might have a copy of it there. I have a website. I think it's actually says BIU at the beginning, Bar Ilan University. It says that at the beginning. And it's called academia.com, if you're familiar with that. No, I think it's academia.edu.
Yes, indeed.
Yeah. So on my, there you can find the link. There might be another place you can find it too. So you're going to, but I'll mention something interesting also a little bit about this, because it actually does beg the question. Because it's very interesting, because if, according to the Tosfot, the halacha follows Rabbi Joshua that the universe was created in Nisan, that changes the whole ballgame, right? That means that our enumeration is only from Adam and Eve and not from before that. Then it becomes a matter of belief, meaning were the 6 days of creation 6 days times 24 hours, or were they something else? I remember one time many years ago, I was at a talk when I was, my early days at Bar Ilan University, I was both a student, doctoral student, and teaching there. And they brought this professor from Ben Gurion University. I won't mention his name, but he was a physicist. And he was a religious physicist. And he gave a talk trying to discredit the theory of scientific theories of evolution, cosmogony, etc. So at the end of his talk, he said, now that I showed you that this whole is all baloney, I'm paraphrasing, you can just remain with the faith of Abraham. So I raised my hand and said, I don't understand something. You're telling us that scientific evolution is wrong because it doesn't agree with Jewish faith. But why do we care how God created the universe as long as he created it? Does it really matter if God created the universe spontaneously or through evolution? And why do I care which way he planned to do the universe? And I said, so he said to me, well, that might be true, but if people believe in evolution, it's going to bring them to the heresy. So I said to them, no, it's because of guys like you who say it doesn't agree with Judaism, that's what brings them to heresy. But if guys like you would say it does agree with Judaism, it wouldn't bring anybody to heresy. So, okay, he didn't like that. But anyhow, the point is that it's sometimes these things are more about, there's an interesting, I wrote an article years ago about exchange of letters between Rabbi Isaac Halevi Herzog, who was the first chief rabbi of Israel in just after the state, about 1950, I think he was appointed. He, by the way, was the grandfather of today's president of Israel, Bougie Herzog, who's also his name Isaac Herzog, right? So that was his grandfather, was the chief rabbi in Israel, 1950. So there's an exchange of letters between Rabbi Herzog and a Jewish doctor who was also a scientist who lived in Princeton, New Jersey, by the name of Emanuel Velikovsky. And Velikovsky wrote two very popular books in the 1970s. And one was called Earth in Collision, another one was called Worlds in Upheaval. It was about his ideas on evolution, and he had an idea how evolution was done by catastrophes, and therefore it took only 15,000 years and not millions of years, whatever. So Rabbi Herzog writes him and it says, is your theory maybe closer to the understanding of the Torah? So Velikovsky writes him back, he says, I don't understand your problem. It says, Christians believe that God came from man, that God was a man. So if God was a man and man comes from an ape, sounds like God comes from an ape. I can understand the problem, but we Jews, we don't believe that God was ever a man. So what does it matter if man came from an ape or came from the dust of the earth, like it says in Genesis? What's the big deal? So I thought that was cute. He writes in his first letter back to me. And then, of course, he tries to explain his theories. I'll say a few words on this just because I opened our little Pandora's box. So I'll say just a few words, but I don't want to carry the discussion too long, and then I want to take a break. The point is like this. There is a very big discussion among our commentators, and unfortunately, a lot of people don't know the sources. I wrote a whole article called, Do the Kabbalists of the Middle Ages Believe that the World was created in 6 days? And it sounds like a simple question, and it's really a diverse, there are at least 4 different opinions on this among Kabbalists. But the point is, what is the problem? The problem is the text itself. If you look in the book of Breshit, what was created on day 1? The sun, right? Excuse me, light. It doesn't say the sun. Light is created on day 1. What is created on day 2? The firmament between the waters. What is created on day 3? The grass and the oceans and the plants. What is created on day 4? The sun, the moon, and the stars. Remember? Adkan? No. Now, the problem is like this. And by the way, Maimonides already mentions this problem in the 12th century. He says, wait a second. Our definition of a day is the Earth rotating on its axis vis-a-vis the sun, which takes 24 hours, correct? That's called a day. But wait a sec. If the sun was created on day 4, so why does the Torah say it was evening, it was morning, day 1, day 2, day 3? Huh? What's that? What definition of a day do you have without a sun? So Maimonides brings up this point already in the 12th century. He has no answer. So he just brings it up, but he doesn't have a good answer. Nachmanides brings up the question again in Gerona in the 13th century. And his answer is like this. He says, well, He says it's true the Kabbalists explain this differently because he was a Kabbalist. But if you want to go back to the simple explanation, so then you'll have to argue that the light on the first day determined the first 3 days, and the sun determined the days from day 4. Okay, it's a little kvetched, it's a little stretched, but that's what, this was also adopted by the Italian Kabbalist Menachem Recanati in the 14th century, who adopted Nachmanides' view. So Nachmanides takes what I call the dual view, which you can either understand the 6 days of creation as 6 times 24 hours, or you can understand them as the Kabbalists did, that they are actually talking about the metaphysical world and not about the physical world. So there are different views about this. I don't want to get you mixed up, but there are various views about this. But the point is that the simple text of Genesis seems to imply that the 6 days were not 24 hours times 6, because there was no sun in day 4. And the text calls it a day anyhow. And if you think that what I'm doing is being made up, there are many sources of Kabbalists who claim that the days of creation were many thousands of years. We need another article I wrote in a journal in Bar Ilan called Badad, Journal 22, where there was a Kabbalist who was born in Lithuania, who came to Jerusalem in the beginning of the 20th century by the name of Shlomo Eliasov. Eliasov actually means the son of Elijah, Eliasov. But his grandson, who was a famous rabbi here in your lifetimes, whose name was Shalom Eliashiv, was a famous rabbi who lived in Mea Sharim. He lived till the age of 104, by the way. And he had 1,000 children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren, quite crazy. And he was well known as a halachic posek in Jerusalem among the what we call the Haredi world and among the religious Zionist world too. He was the grandson, but the grandfather was less known. He was only known, of course, in Kabbalistic circles. And the grandfather writes very clearly in his book, Sefer Drashot Olam HaTohu, that it seems quite obvious that the days of creation were very long days, possibly many thousands of years each one. He has no clue because he's, okay, but he says very long days, and it doesn't even without, you know, the squint of an eyelid, he says that possibly thousands of years. Now, how does this all connect to what we just saw in the Talmud? If the opinion is according to Rabbi Joshua, that that Adam and Eve were created on the 1st of Tishrei, so how can the universe be created on the beginning of Nisan? The answer is very simple. If the 6 days are not 24 hours, of course it could be. Right? Because the beginning, whenever the beginning of time was, could have been at the beginning of Tishrei. And then millions of years later, when Adam and Eve were formed, which is called the 6th day of creation, that was on the 1st of Tishrei. If you're following my logic. In other words, the Talmudic discussion in Rosh Hashana might possibly hint to the fact that the 6 days were not 6 days, because they're already saying that the creation of the universe was on the 1st of Tishrei, and the creation of Adam and Eve, the creation of the universe was on the 1st of Nisan, and Adam and Eve were created on the 1st of Tishrei. But nobody seems to notice that. So, okay, that's all I wanted to say about that particular point. So, in summary, in our understanding of Rosh Hashana, there are 3 aspects to Rosh Hashana, and each one of them is tied together inherently. Number 1, Rosh Hashana and Yom Kippur represent days of judgment. Number 2, vis-a-vis the agricultural year, the Talmud actually says there's days of agricultural judgment, which is at the beginning of Nisan, when you plant, Pesach, and Shavuot, when you harvest, and Rosh Hashanah is the days of judgment for people. But in the agricultural year, it's Pesach and Shavuot. In fact, actually, Tishrei for the agricultural year is the end of the agricultural year, because you bring everything into the house. And festival of Sukkot, Chag Asif, and then you have the rainy season, then you start again in April and in Nisan. So it's both the beginning of the year and the end of the year in a sense, Tishrei time. So that's So again, the first aspect is the days of judgment for human beings. So the second aspect is its relationship to the agricultural year. And the third aspect is the discussion of the creation of the universe. But it turns out that Rosh Hashana, the first of Tishrei, according to all opinions, is when Adam and Eve was created. I said, based on that, if you want, you can speculate whether those first 5 days were actually 24 hours or not. And that is open to speculation. And because of that, because we don't have certain sources about that, if you want to speculate that the days were longer, there are those opinions that you can rest upon. Okay, questions? I addressed a little bit your question, Marta, right? So yeah. Shailot, question? Yes, Julia.
What does it mean, like agricultural judgment? Like the trees are being judged, or
No, it's the people again. But remember, in an agricultural society where your food is based on the agricultural year, so you are very nervous when the planting season comes. And you're very nervous when the harvest season comes, because you can plant and not harvest, because you can have locusts eat it up, you can have a bad crop, you can have rain in the wrong time, too much sun and a drought and all these things, right? So in that sense, it's judgment, because human beings who are dependent on the rain and the good agricultural year, we need to pray to God to help us. That's why, by the way, Sukkot, we pray for rain before the rainy season, because sometimes there's a drought. So even Rosh Hashana, which is the time for judgment for human beings, Sukkot is right away the time for judgment for the agricultural year. In an agricultural society, you cannot separate the two, because human beings live on food. And if we don't have food, we have nothing. In today's society, where we can plant on one side of the world and sell it on the other side of the world, we have solved a lot of those problems. But unfortunately, sometimes we take away too much of the agricultural land and we're taking risks, right? There's much less agricultural land today, which is used for the whole world. And there are some countries which have very little agriculture and other countries which have lots of agriculture in order to balance things around. So there is food, but the food is, because of that, is not always distributed equally. You know, we say in Birkat HaMazon, Hazan et ha'olam kulo b'tovo, that God gives nutrition for the whole world. So somebody once said to me, what do you mean God gives nutrition to the whole world? There's not starving people in Biafra and other countries where they don't have enough food? The answer is, God gives enough food for mankind. What mankind does with the food is already our problem. You know, I think it was the 1980s, there was a award-winning book which was printed in the United States called The Grapes of Wrath. And the book was all about the well-known economically based destruction of produce, which goes on in the United States, as in most countries, in order to control prices. Right? If too many people are producing tomatoes and the market is flooded with tomatoes, the price of tomatoes go down, farmers lose out, the middlemen lose out, grocery stores lose out, everybody's losing out. So, you know, so they have to, in order to balance the prices, the government has to pay certain farmers to destroy their crops. Same thing could be with avocados. The same thing could be on and on and on. Fruits, vegetables. This happens every year. You have millions and millions of produce which are destroyed in order to balance the price in the market. So as I said, God gives the food. What human beings do with it, that's another question. I'm not saying I don't understand why they do it. I'm just saying that food's there. You want to figure out how to help people whose country had a drought, figure it out. So the food is there. By the way, there's a group in Tel Aviv that worked for a long time. I think even Leket Yisrael does this, but I'm not sure, where they would go to various restaurants and halls, and at the end of the day, ask for the leftover food that was not touched by anybody, because according to the Ministry of Health, all these institutions must destroy the food at the end of the day. But if somebody private wants to take the food, they can. But most of the time, they don't give it to them. Same thing, by the way, the Israel army. If you have cooked food, by the end of the day, even if nobody touched it, it has to be destroyed by the end of the day. No refrigeration, no chances. So, by the way, when I was in the army, they had just passed a law not to throw out the bread which is left in the bread basket at the end of the day because they were throwing out all the bread too, so they stopped that and they saved 3 million shekels a year for not throwing out the bread, which was left on and not on the table, in the baskets, I mean, in the bread baskets. So, the question is also what you do with food. There's definitely in the institutions in Israel, there's enough food to give to poor people if you want to do it that way. No need to raise the money. Just go around collecting it, give them some tax benefit from the government, and you can, Israel.